Okay, so I apologize for the fact it took whole hour and I didn't even get through book four. So I'll try to finish up on the Republic, on my view of it, or what I think is most important um, in this video. So, okay, in book four, the views of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice are all completely traditional. They advocate blind obedience. Courage is civic courage, doing what you're told because you're told, because you want honor from the rulers, or you want to avoid shame. This was straight out of Aristotle. Um, Temperance or self-control is obeying the rulers because they're the better part as opposed to you, and also obeying your own calculations when you want to, in terms of eating, drinking, and sex, making sure you control your appetites with reason, um, but you never question the status quo. Wisdom is good judgment, which Thrasymachus used to describe the perfectly unjust person that gets a city wrapped around his feet. So this city is a city where somebody could wrap it around their feet if they were good enough at rhetoric, which of course is what Thrasymachus' specialty is. If they were good enough at speech making and persuading everybody else that they are just the best ruler, and um, everybody else should listen to them. And then justice is no meddling in the classes and telling noble lies to make sure that people stay in their class, or the noble lie to explain if you want to move someone, a few people, into a different class. Well, Socrates says, geez, it's kind of dark down here. And I mean, it's clearly the cave view of things. Socrates himself was a meddler, whatever. So then, but as I said, like Hobbes, if people really are insatiable creatures, unlike any other animal, they're just an insatiable animal. They're an animal that, if given what they want, will completely self-destruct due to lack of self-control. They will just never, desire is infinite, and they will give in to it. So you must control them. Um, and if you have an absolute ruler, people will be happier, and they will um, be more unified, and they won't make each other miserable, and they won't make themselves miserable. So, as a matter of fact, it's true on that assumption. Then in book five, if you want to take it even further, you want to breed people. You want to have a eugenics program. If you really want to really get into this assumption that we're all just a bunch of animals, um, and you have a community of women and children and blah blah, and then Socrates says, isn't the point of this to have this community of pleasure and pain where nobody even knows who their kids are? And so when one person gets hurt, everybody feels bad, and when one person is happy, everybody, okay. Well, the issue is, on Aristotle's virtues, there's rational courage, there's rational temperance, and there's rational generosity. Generosity is a virtue. You have to care about other people. And liberality means that you contribute money to help other people. So these are the fundamental virtues, and actually Socrates has those virtues. So what it's saying is, if you assume people do not have reason, they don't have that power of reason, so they could never act this way out of knowledge and an intuition, an educated intuition, that they should fight in wars in this context but not that context just because it's the right thing to do, or they should have temperance because there are other more important things. Just keeping food, drink, and sex in its proper place is the best way to live a life dedicated to wisdom, virtue, and truth and justice. And then generosity. You should care about other people. You should have empathy with them. You should have goodwill and trust. These are all the basic foundations for having stability. And your reason, it's totally rational. But if people are irrational, you have to force them. And and so there's really two ways to get to a society where people actually care about each other. If you assume they couldn't possibly get there through their mind, their nous, through wisdom, then Republic Book 2 through the beginning of 5 is the best way. On that assumption, people are totally out of control. Okay, so then he has this waves of women and children and all that. So then the last wave is philosophers. And all of a sudden, he switches gears. And he starts talking about the faculties. Well, it gets translated faculties. Well, he does say, okay, he does say, okay, I will call them powers, the powers of the soul. And then he starts in the divided line, and he starts with the lovers of sight versus the lovers of the mind. And so, again, he's indicating, so far we've been in the world of appearances. And then in book 6, at the end of 5, he says the desire for wisdom. And he tells Glaucon, you're erotically inclined toward young men, and the desire for wisdom is different from pleasure or honor. And he's making this transition. He's trying to suggest that the human soul is capable of a higher point of view. And he distinguishes the blind, the ignorant have no clear model in their souls, and so they cannot, in the manner of painters, look to what is more true, make constant reference to it, and study it as exactly as possible. Hence, they cannot establish here on earth conventions about what is fine or just or good, when they need to be established, or guard and preserve them once they've been established. We have to understand the nature of philosophers first. And in the beginning of Book 6, he says, someone who loves learning must above all strive for every kind of truth from childhood on. When someone's desires incline strongly for one thing, the desires are weakened for others. He'd be concerned with the pleasures of the soul itself by itself, and he'd abandon those pleasures that come through the body. So he would be moderate and not a money lover. He would not be petty. Pettiness is altogether incompatible with this kind of soul. He's high-minded. He won't consider death a terrible thing. So he's just and gentle from youth on. He's a quick learner. He loves truth, justice, courage, and moderation, except that they're fundamentally different. Fundamentally, right? It's not a matter of degree. It's a difference in kind. And Socrates says that. He said we have to start from a new archive, a new first principle. So, rational temperance or moderation is just based on being so focused on the love of wisdom, you just are pretty indifferent. So the appetitive part of the soul is not the biggest part of the soul. The love of wisdom is by far the biggest part of the soul. Okay, if you love wisdom, you won't fear death. And so, in a situation of war, you will face death. You won't run away, you won't be scared, which is exactly the way Socrates was. But you're not going to do it to get honors from the city or to fear being condemned. You're not going to necessarily believe that your city's totally right or that everything you're asked to do is right. There's no blind obedience here. It's just that if the city needs to be secured, if it's getting attacked, a philosopher would be willing to fight, would be considered a brave fighter simply because the philosopher doesn't fear death. And then justice would be always ruling for the well being of the ruled, and every use of intellectual power would be for the benefit of the city, for the common good, because intuitively that's the way everyone can flourish. So you can achieve the goal of the community of pleasure and pain without it being forced. You just do it through wisdom because it's intuitively obvious that we all need each other. We should help each other out in every way we can. And love's truth, that would be, and Plato gets there, that the universe is actually guided by this principle of order and good. And so the truth is, we're capable, we're naturally designed to love good and to seek higher and higher levels of flourishing, just like the universe is going to higher and higher levels of complexity. And that's what we have to do in order to fulfill our nature. Um, and then he says the philosophers appear to everybody else to be either a crank or vicious, and the philosophers really should be navigating the ship, but they're out stargazing, trying to figure out what's the human nature, what's the human condition, what sort of laws and habits should a society cultivate in order to encourage the love of wisdom in people. And obviously, the people who founded or developed Athenian culture had been thinking about that. Um, and, it's too bad that the Athenians don't appreciate the legacy that they inherited. And then Socrates explains how the philosophical nature gets corrupted. And at a certain point, he says he gets angry about it, the way it gets corrupted. And he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I got a little high spirited. I shouldn't do that." So Socrates has a thumos. His thumos kind of erupts because he's so upset about what happens to philosophy and the philosophical nature. It's not about him. But in Republic Book 2 through 4, Glaucon, when he talks about the spirited part, thumos, which is also represented in the city as the military, he talks of, Socrates says, don't you get angry when people misunderstand you or they misjudge you? Oh, yes, yes. So wounded pride and all this other stuff. And Socrates at this one point, well, that's intended to awaken the reader to say Socrates is not thumatic. And so Socrates' soul is not a three-part soul. It's a fundamentally different soul. It's a one-part soul. So, like in the Phaedrus, he has tamed the dark horse and he's taken those energies and transformed them, directed them toward the erotic love of wisdom. It's the same as the ladder of love. It's over and over again, you have these models where the punchline is the only way to live with integrity is to love wisdom. It's the only way to be able to integrate desires, emotions, thought processes, and ultimately leading to nous and your mind. And again, Carl Jung says that. He's got all the biology and all that, but the model is if you want to be a healthy, flourishing specimen of the human species, you do not have a three-part soul. You have a one-part soul. soul. Um, okay, and then, um, all right, so the philosophers wipe the slate clean. We need to take the city and the characters of human beings as their sketching slate and wipe it clean. Start over. And we need to look toward the nature of justice, beauty, moderation, and the like, and toward what that you're trying to put it into people and mix it and blend it. So, and that's what actually Plato is trying to do. And he says, in order to get the finest possible view of these matters, we said we would need to take a longer road that would make it plain to anyone who took it, but that it was possible to give demonstrations of what they are, justice, courage, and temperance, that would be up to the standard of the previous argument. And Glaucon says, well, let me read some of the quotes here. Okay, the discussions after the discussion of this whole system of education, Socrates rejects it. He says, "It seems to me that our discussion at that time fell short of exactness." And Glaucon replies and says, "I thought you gave us good measure, and so apparently did the others." And Socrates admonishes him, "Any measure of such things that falls short in any way of that which is not good measure, of that which is not good measure. For nothing incomplete is the measure of anything, although people are sometimes of the opinion that an incomplete treatment is nonetheless adequate and makes further investigation unnecessary." That's the world of opinions. Well, this is close enough. The model of the appetitive part is the biggest, is close enough. Socrates says, no, it's not. It's totally wrong. And it shouldn't be the model that we work on when we're trying to figure out legislation, when we're trying to rule, to govern in any sense. Socrates says, the subject of the education of the rulers has to be taken up again from the beginning, from a new archive, and that they must take the longer road. He rejects the previous view. Even for the virtues themselves, it isn't enough to look at a mere sketch as we did before, while neglecting the most complete account. The new system of education is focused on the education of the power of the mind. This power is present in everyone's soul. He says, there is in every soul an organ or instrument of knowledge that is purified and kindled afresh by such studies when it has been destroyed and blinded by our ordinary pursuits. And the word knowledge is, it doesn't mean episteme, science, it means noetic, it means wisdom. Socrates contrasts the education of this power to learn with the previous system of education. The other so-called virtues of the soul are akin to those of the body, for they really aren't there beforehand, but are added later by habit and practice. However, the virtue of reason seems to belong above all to something more divine. The power of reason cannot be educated until it is turned away from the world of appearances and opinions toward the world of knowledge and reality. Quote, "The instrument with which each person learns is like an eye that cannot be turned around from darkness to light without turning the whole body. The nature of true education is the craft concerning with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. This model for education rejects the previous one, because children can be given good habits and yet become wicked adults if the power of their minds is directed toward the pursuit of power, wealth, or honor at everyone else's expense." Quote, "The virtue of reason never loses its power, but is either useful and beneficial or useless and harmful, depending upon the way it is turned. Or have you never noticed about people who are said to be vicious but clever, how keen the vision of their little souls is, and how sharply it distinguishes the things it is turned toward. This shows that its sight isn't inferior, but rather is forced to serve evil ends, and that the sharper it sees, the more evil it accomplishes. And this is what happens in the dialogues. Alcibiades is the smartest, and he becomes the most evil because he decides that power and wealth are what really matter. Thrasymachus is plenty bright. The sophists have these reasoning powers, but they have the wrong idea of the good. Their nous, their mind, is turned in the wrong direction. And that's why Plato says the most important part of dialectical education is education for the idea of the good. You have to have an idea of the good in order to cultivate your nous, your noetic capacity. You're not going to know how to live wisely, what the best thing to do is in a situation, unless you cultivate the idea of the good. In Book 6, Glaucon himself recognizes that the earlier education in music and poetry has no relation to the education of the mind, nous. The system of education in Book 2 through 5, says Glaucon, quote, educated the guardians through habits. Its harmonies gave them a certain harmoniousness, and not knowledge. Its rhythms gave them a certain rhythmic quality, and its stories, whether fictional or nearer the truth, cultivated other habits akin to these. But as for the subject you're looking for now, there's nothing like that in music and poetry. Socrates says, your reminder is exactly to the point. And in Book 4, the big concept is that the three parts of the soul are harmonized. And he emphasizes this harmony, three parts, and it's all great. And so now they're just completely rejecting that. Okay, and so they start this new system of education. The next step is to study number and calculation, but to do so in a way that trains the intellect. Quote, the study of the natures of the numbers by means of understanding itself, not like tradesmen and retailers do, for the sake of buying and selling, but for ease in turning the soul around, away from becoming and toward truth and being. Ultimately, the study of geometry and calculation should be taken up in the way that will make it easier to see the form of the good. The study of astronomy must also be learned in a different way. We should consider the decorations in the sky to be the most beautiful and most exact of visible things, but we should consider the motions to fall far short of the true ones, motions that are really fast or slow, as measured in true numbers, that trace out true geometrical figures, that are all in relation to one another, and that are the true motions of the things carried along in them. And these must be grasped by reason and thought, not by sight. If, by really taking part in astronomy, we're to make the naturally intelligent part of the soul useful instead of useless, let's study astronomy by means of problems, as we do geometry, and leave the things in the sky alone. From astronomy he moves to harmonics. As the eyes fasten on astronomical motion, so the ears fasten on harmonic ones. He gives a damning criticism of the way harmonics is currently taught in Athens. They talk about something they call a dense interval or quarter tone, putting their ears to their instruments like something trying to overhear what the neighbors are saying. They put their ears before their understanding. The teachers of harmonics make the same mistake the teachers of astronomy do. They seek out numbers that are to be found in these audible consonances, but they don't make assent to problems. The only way to study all these, that is useful in the search for the beautiful and the good, is when the inquiry into all the subjects we've mentioned brings out their association and relationship with one another and draws conclusions about their kinship. Otherwise, it's in vain. So, then he says, we have to get up to the level of dialectic. And he says, when anyone by dialectic attempts through discourse of reason. Okay, so all the previous things were just preparation for dialectic. Now we have to get education in dialectic. Um, when anyone by dialectic attempts through discourse of reason and apart from all perceptions of sense to find his way to the essence of each thing, and does not desist till he apprehends by thought itself the nature of the good itself, he arrives at the limit of the intelligible. Okay, and let's see. All this procedure of the arts and sciences that we have described indicates their power to lead the best part of the soul up to the contemplation of what is best among realities. And he says, you won't be able to follow Glaucon. You need to stay in school. And of course, Glaucon doesn't, and he ends up getting involved in politics and getting killed. But, okay, so yeah, and Socrates uses the image of the cave, okay? People start out looking at shadows on the wall of the cave. And the sophists are dedicated to these shadows. The shadow is that it appears to be, they make a generalization from the shadow that physical human beings cast. Okay? It appears that people care about sex, money, power, and the fear of death. And that they should. And so the people in the cave are looking at those shadows, trying to figure out how they can get sex, money, power, and avoid death, or avoid fearing death, bribing the gods. So you have to turn around from that, and you have to turn toward, you have to find your way outside of the cave. Then once you get out there, all you see are the plants and animals, the results of the sun. And then you have to see that the sun is the cause, and then you have to see the power behind the sun. That there's a power of good, a power of order and evolution, this power of nous, that is the cause of everything else, every other layer. Okay. And then he says, dialectic is the only process of inquiry that advances in this manner. It does away with hypothesis up to the first principle itself. And it is literally true that when the eye of the soul is sunk in the barbaric sloth of the Orphic myth, dialectic gently draws it forth and leads it up, employing as helpers and cooperators the studies which we enumerated. Okay? And then, okay, so this is my thesis about Plato's dialogues, that they are dialectic, and that Plato does argue that there's a power of mind, that the universe, it's a first principle of the universe. Therefore, the power of mind should be the first principle of a human life. And Socrates says that all of my choices, my whole life, was driven by my mind. Okay, so Plato has given us a literary image of the kind of life that we should aspire to live. But it's just black marks on paper, you know. It isn't the real thing. And of course, it's not even living or breathing. I mean, it's an imaginary image. We can have this image in our imagination of Socrates, but it's not the real Socrates. It's not a real person. So then Plato says, somebody claimed that they could write down his doctrine, and he said, there's no way of putting it in words like other studies. Acquaintance with it must come rather after a long period of attendance on instruction in the subject itself, and of close companionship, when suddenly, like a blaze kindled by a leaping spark, it's generated in the soul and at once becomes self-sustaining. And this is when you have Socrates described as having a relationship with a student, and you have this close companionship, right? And this projection, mutual projection. Both of you love Zeus, and you walk together in life, discoursing about your love for justice and acting justly. And okay, again, Plato says um, that there are three kinds of objects through which knowledge must come. And the knowledge itself is the fourth, and then there's a fifth. So there's 5 layers. First is the name. Okay, and he uses a circle as an example. Second is a description. Okay, definition. All the points equal from one point, equidistant from a point. Third, an image. Of course, we have a visual image. Fourth, a knowledge of the object. Okay. So you have knowledge. You might be able to understand geometry and circles and all that sort of stuff. But there's this highest intuition where you know it when you see it. You know, okay, it's that immediate connection. And that's the highest kind of intuition. It's over and above just the verbal or just the physical visual image or anything like that. You realize, okay, it's an entity, it's an essence, it's an object simply of the intellect. Okay, so no intelligent person will ever be as bold as to put into language those things which his reason has contemplated, especially not into a form that's unalterable, which is the case in written symbols. There are 2 things, the essential reality and the particular quality. When the mind is in quest of knowledge, not of the particular but the essential, each of the 4 levels confronts the mind with the unsought particular, right? It keeps particularizing things, the visual image, the definition, right? Those are, it's beyond, whether in verbal or bodily form. Each of the 4 makes the reality that is expressed in words or illustrated in objects liable to easy refutation by the evidence of the senses. The result is to make practically every person prey to perplexity and uncertainty. Okay, consideration of all 4 in turn, moving up and down from one to another, barely begets knowledge of a naturally flawless object in a naturally flawless person. The study of virtue and vice must be accompanied by an inquiry into what is false and true of existence in general, and must be carried on by constant practice throughout a long period. Let's see, after practicing detailed comparisons of names and definitions and visual and other sense perceptions, after scrutinizing them in benevolent disputation by the use of question and answer without jealousy, at last, in a flash, understanding of each blazes up, and the mind, as it exerts all its powers to the limit of human capacity, is flooded with light. Okay. Neither would anyone put the doctrine in writing to aid his own memory, for there's no danger of anyone forgetting it once his mind grasps it, since it is contained in the very briefest statements. And the claim I want to make here is that Plato has this image of Socrates. The image is that Socrates is doing everything you have to do to live on those 4 levels. He's taking a question, he's trying to define what is justice, what is virtue. The Socrates is a literary image of it. They talk about people as if in our imaginations we think that they're visual objects. He tries to gain knowledge, all that stuff. But then, at a higher level, Socrates says he has hypotheses. He says if virtue is knowledge, it must be teachable. If it's not knowledge, then it shouldn't be teachable. But Plato gives you this image of Socrates as a dialectician, as opposed to Meno, for example, who claims to teach virtue, and the two kinds of approaches and all of that. But the point is, I think that at a certain point, you realize that Socrates is what they're talking about. You can have that intuitive insight, but it isn't. Socrates is just this literary image that people, flesh and blood people, when they're talking to each other, all of a sudden they can have this recognition that this person is noetic. This person is making, living the truth, is what Aristotle would say, is embodying wisdom. This is what wisdom is. This is what virtue is. And let me give an example from other wisdom literature, because the Greeks, I think, should be read as more like Hindus or Buddhism or Confucianism than like what followed afterwards, because, well, the Stoics are fine. The Stoic sage, all of these traditions that focus on wisdom have tried to do the same thing. They have literary images of the Stoic sage. They describe the kinds of conversations about virtue this sage has. They describe that his soul is unified, that he's a microcosm in the macrocosm. In Confucius' case, they have a word for that. It's called, says Confucius had the gung fu. And it, like, you can't define it, you can't explain it, you just get it. You just know that he had it. And he had all the qualities that Socrates had: temperance, courage, all that. Plus, he also was very perceptive about his disciples, the young men that followed him around. He understood their character. He understood what to say to them to kind of draw them out. And then you have Buddha, and Buddha's meditation practices so that people could develop a Buddha mind. And then the reason Buddha didn't just call it all off after he was enlightened was he said there will be some who will understand. And so there's a process of passing on the Buddha mind from one person to another, and it's compared to a flame of a candle. Again, pure energy, pure light. And so Plato talks about the light of the mind. And then there's the Hindu guru, right? There are many corruptions, of course, but all of these traditions have this, they try to define, they try to lead you to, that you can get to this level where there's this insight and somebody is just living the light or living the truth. They just get it. They are what the good is, or the human good lived out in life. This is what it is. And so let me just give you some examples. So I want to try to explain how Socrates is the virtues and is what justice is. You don't need any more hypotheses. I mean, he's talking about it, blah, blah. But then you have this reversal and recognition, and you say, Socrates obviously is just a literary image. That's why Plato would say, I never wrote it down, because you can't write it. But he's pointing to it, okay? But you have to be in the presence of it. You have to be in dialogue with the person. A meeting of the minds, the tragedies have that. We are of one mind. That's the highest level of human friendship. So these patterns are the same. And okay, so Socrates is actually Plato's closest image of what he's trying to get at. But what he's trying to get at is inseparable from living your life. And Plato doesn't live your life for you. You have to live your life. So I can sit here, and I'm going to for 15 minutes, and describe how I think Socrates is an image of what these virtues really are. He embodies them. And yet I can get up from here and go and kill somebody, steal something, you know. Because once you get it in a logos form, you can separate yourself from it. That's why. Or you could converse about virtue all you want. And Aristotle says that most people would rather talk about it than actually do it or be what virtue is. Live the truth. And so there is a total difference between observing somebody who you think has done a virtuous act. You don't know because you don't know why. And you don't know if they're doing something noble because it's noble. You don't know if they have a firm and unchangeable character. You don't know if the particular motive in this particular case is just noetic. So you can't tell by looking who's virtuous and who's vicious. You can't see the life of the mind. The only way to really cultivate it is you get the dialectical training and you are in conversation, meaningful conversation with another person, and you live out your life. You're accountable, but it's the intuition in a critical moment that you can actually do what's best. You can be the truth of the situation. That's just over and above anything we can sit and talk about. So, but let me give you examples of how Plato tries as hard as he can to give an image. Okay, so I said this on my Lakey's tape, which is that Socrates is talking to Nicias and Lakes about courage. And Lakes has citizen courage. Stand by your post, do what you're told. And Socrates says, well, what about the times when it really worked better to back off and let the Persians go in through the mountain pass and then surround them? Or this other time when it was more strategic to back off or to lie, cheat, steal, whatever. And so Lakes loses it, but he's high spirited. High spiritedness is not courage, it needs to get tied to reason. And then Nicias, on the other hand, and there was other, Lakes might be confident because he's ignorant. On the other hand, Nicias might be confident because he's already calculated that he's going to win and that he's safe. He's a professional soldier, and when things get tight and he knows he's really in danger, he'll hightail it out of there, which actually Nicias didn't. But he made plenty of mistakes. Okay, so Nicias was overly intellectual. He tied courage to the knowledge of good and evil about everything, and actually a lot of it is knowing what to do in a given situation, in a situation that often involves serious death and destruction and also requires quick choices. I mean, that's difficult. But somebody who could really do it is the truth. It really is possible. It's actual. We study history and historical figures in order to try and learn the patterns, so maybe we could be able to actually do it in the situation. And then Socrates is somebody that Lakes trusts because he can fight in a dangerous situation. And then Nicias trusts because he's also reflective. And then when they find out neither of them knows what courage is, Socrates says, well, we have to have the courage to admit that we don't know, and we have to go back and study some more. So Socrates is what courage is, right? He is it. He embodies it. And again, Aristotle says that. The person of practical wisdom is the truth in the situation. Well, but Socrates is not, because he's just a piece of black marks on white paper. But you have to use an analogy, okay? A person who actually lives this way, a person who actually did this in this situation, and was this kind of person, and blah blah. They are what courage is. You don't need any more hypotheses or definition. That's it. So that's the immediate intuition. That's what goes beyond the hypotheses to the actual essence, right? And the essence is a manifestation, right? An embodiment. There's no disembodied essences. The essence is when people are actually doing these things. And Plato gives an image of this character who's actually doing it as the closest possible way to trigger intuition so that you could become, live the wise life. Well, let me just use another example. With temperance or self-control. Socrates, Alcibiades, you remember, he said he can drink but he never gets drunk. If there's food, he enjoys it. If there isn't, he doesn't whine. And this fits the pattern in Book 6 of the Republic. He doesn't repress appetites. He's not yelling at himself to eat more or less or drink more or less. He's just interested in wisdom, and eating and drinking are a part of life, so he engages in it, but he's also his sexuality, he's monogamous, and when people aren't, there's clearly all sorts of problems which are related in Greek myth, in tragedy, and in Plato's dialogues. I mean, all over the place. It would be crazy not to be monogamous, because violating that creates so many problems. And then, anyway, so he is what temperance is, but he doesn't do it because he worries about, he doesn't have any ulterior motives, he doesn't, whatever. It's just because he loves wisdom, that the appetites aren't that big a deal. And that is it, right? That's it. You don't need any more hypotheses or whatever, but all the words in the world aren't going to get you there, because it is, this instantiation is part of an ergon, a way of life. There's no justice in the sky or courage out in some separate world or whatever. Okay, and then justice is rule for the sake of the ruled. And Socrates is what justice is. Socrates is the philosophical ruler, really in all the dialogues. But in the Republic, it shows up a little bit more, but he's always ruling for the sake of the ruled. He's always using whatever authority he has to promote the well-being of the people he's talking to. He always tries to lead them toward becoming more flourishing people. That is what justice is. It doesn't. Justice is manifested in human relationships. It's not in a sky somewhere, and it's not. There's an analog in the natural world, because the natural world runs according to principles of rectification of wrong, right? If you violate nature, she will heal herself, and maybe at your expense. You better, depending upon where you happen to be. And justice, there are natural sort of principles or powers that you can call justice, but it's better to call them just nature seeks a balance, balances itself, heals itself, occurs in self-regulating systems, so it regulates itself, and it moves toward higher levels of complexity. So justice is concerned when human beings relate to each other and they create a self-sufficient society, and they treat each other in a way that promotes stability and basic avoidance of violating extremes that would undermine health and stability, and then also evolution toward higher levels of complexity. Okay, so Socrates he's the true orator. He says that in the Gorgias. He's the dialectical orator. When he gives a speech, he does it for the sake of the well-being of the people. He does it for the sake of truth, that we would follow, he does it to cultivate, to activate, to promote, to try to get other people to activate those natural powers of soul. That is the only way we can flourish as human beings. Um, Generosity, friendship, anger. Socrates doesn't get angry very much. Again, when he said his thumos erupted because of how philosophy, he says, I shouldn't have gotten so angry. So he's basically uh, mild-tempered, doesn't overreact, but every once in a while he gets angry. And then in relationship to Alcibiades and the symposium, Alcibiades is really interested in power, and he claims that Socrates is jealous of him, and he's saying that Socrates really fights back. He gets feisty, because if he doesn't, Alcibiades is going to win this battle. So Alcibiades is the one who starts it and goes at it, and Socrates will fight back. And the same thing happens verbally in the Protagoras, where Protagoras, the sophists, of course, treat the discussion of serious questions as if it were a boxing match, a competition, and you try to knock the other guy down. And the Protagoras does this in the last third of the dialogue, Protagoras, and he knocks down Piteus. He quotes from these old wise sayings, and he says something that's very self-interested, and he gets an applause. So he's performing, and he's knocking down the old wise guys and making himself the new wise guy. And Socrates actually comes back, and he misquotes, and he manipulates, and he fights back, and he knocks down Protagoras. He wins the boxing match, but he doesn't want this to be reduced to a boxing match, but he will fight back for the sake of the truth. So again and again, Plato has created this image of a person who is driven by his mind, but the truth is, the real example of that is something you have to live. It's not something you can read about or write about or talk about. It's your life. You have to embody it, instantiate it, and that is much harder, much harder. And you can. I mean, I'm not necessarily a better person for having gotten so obsessed about Plato. I might have actually had a better character if I had a job, maybe as a lawyer or something, where I actually had to make decisions about justice a lot more than I do when I sit as an academic in my study and read Plato. I'm not embodying the truth. I'm reading about it. And that isn't it. But there is an it, and I'm describing what the it is. And I think that explains Plato, and it explains why he says you don't need to write it down, because there's no danger of forgetting it once your mind gets it, because it's contained in very brief statements. And it is. There's a nous, a first principle of being. It's why we evolved, why a creature that's capable of understanding the universe evolved, because there is that first principle. Our only way of flourishing is to use our nous. We have to create, we're totally dependent on other people. We have to create social and political systems in order to be human. And all these virtues arise as a response to our situation. And the virtues are how people behave when they're using their nous. it's not that complicated. In theory, right? Writing it down, definitions are not difficult. You're not going to forget it. But that's not it. It is living this out. And Plato tries to write about a life. And he tries to write about this life in relationship to all the issues, all the powers of the soul, and all the mistakes people make. And so, so I hope I can work some more on Plato because I have Martha's theory of Plato's theory of everything. Because I really think he tried to be comprehensive. And it does, I would actually read it with this incredible desire to try and see how it all fits together because he says it does. He says the dialectician, he says if the universe is driven by mind, it all fits together. And he says a dialectician sees the whole and the parts in relation to the whole. So the way to read Plato's dialogues is to see them as a whole and the parts in relation to the whole. And the whole is a universe driven by nous and a life of a human being driven by nous in all of its different aspects. And that's what I would recommend as the paradigm according to which to try and to interpret Plato, to go at understanding Plato and trying to understand what he's trying to tell us, because I think the messages are extremely important. How you can have this wonderful society designed around cultivating the souls of people and how you can lose it. I think those are really important issues, especially in the era of globalization.